In a close-knit town, a single act of prejudice at a small eatery sparks an unexpected series of events. The longtime owner makes a grave mistake when he denies service to a highly respected local veteran. The veteran, hurt and confused by this unanticipated discrimination, walks away thinking the painful incident is over. Little does the owner realize, however, that his actions have been noticed by someone who holds the power to challenge the community's long-standing biases. What follows will surprise everyone and offer a powerful lesson about forgiveness and transformation. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. James Porter sighed heavily as he carefully stepped out of his worn-down pickup, feeling the familiar aches that marked years of military service. The warm southern sun highlighted the deep lines on his face, telling stories of a life lived with loyalty and resilience. He gazed at the weathered sign above Ben's Cafe with a soft smile. He'd been coming to this diner for years, drawn by the promise of good food and warm conversations. As he pushed open the door, the cheerful jingle of bells welcomed him, along with the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon, which made his stomach growl in anticipation. James made his way to his usual spot at the counter, nodding politely to the other regulars as he passed. But something felt off today. The usual friendly chatter seemed to stop abruptly as he entered, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Settling into his seat, James glanced up to see Ben Roberts, the cafe owner, emerge from the kitchen. Usually, Ben wore a welcoming smile, but today his face was hard, his gaze icy and distant. He stared at James with a look that made the old veteran shift uncomfortably in his seat. "What can I get for you, James?" Ben's voice was gruff, lacking its usual warmth. James, choosing to ignore the change in Ben's demeanor, smiled gently. "Just the usual, Ben. A cup of coffee and a slice of that famous peach pie of yours." Ben's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the counter. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, James. We're all out of pie today." James looked puzzled, glancing over to where a freshly baked peach pie was clearly visible on the counter. "But Ben, I can see it right there." "I said we're out," Ben interrupted, his voice rising sharply, causing a few patrons to jump in surprise. "In fact, we're closing early today. You'll have to leave." A heavy silence fell over the cafe. James sat, frozen, struggling to process what was happening. In all his years of coming to Ben's Cafe, he'd never been treated this way. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding his gaze, others watching with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Slowly, James rose from his seat, his heart heavy as he prepared to walk away. With weathered hands trembling slightly, James stammered, "Ben, I don't understand. Have I done something to offend you?" Ben's face twisted into a sneer. "You've done plenty, just by showing your face here. I don't serve your kind in my place. Now get out, or I'll call the authorities." The words struck James like a blow. Stunned, he staggered back, his eyes wide with hurt and disbelief. For a brief moment, he was transported back to his youth, a time when such prejudice was painfully common. But this was Ben, a man he'd considered a friend for years. As James shuffled toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. At a nearby table, a young woman stood up, her voice quivering. "This isn't right. You can't treat him like this." Ben turned on her, his face flushed with anger. "This is my cafe, and I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The woman hesitated, torn between standing up for what was right and fearing confrontation. In the end, she sat back down, shame filling her eyes as she watched James leave. The door closed behind him, and the cafe buzzed with whispers. Some patrons hurried to pay their bills and left, unwilling to support such discrimination, while others remained, either silently condoning Ben's actions or simply too stunned to react. What Ben didn't realize was that his act of prejudice had just set off a series of events that would shake the foundations of their quiet town. If he had known who James Porter really was, and the influential connections he held, he might have thought twice. But as it was, Ben Roberts had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and the consequences were about to crash down on him like a tidal wave. As James walked back to his truck, the warm sunlight that had felt comforting earlier now seemed to mock him. highlighting the stark reality of the prejudice he'd just encountered. Climbing into his truck, he gripped the steering wheel, his hands shaking. He sat for a long moment, staring blankly ahead as hurt and humiliation washed over him in waves, threatening to drown him in despair. Then slowly something changed in James's expression. His jaw tightened with determination, and a fire ignited in his eyes. James Porter was many things: a veteran, a father, a respected figure in the community. But he was not a man to accept injustice quietly. As he started the engine, his mind was already forming a plan. Ben Roberts might have thrown him out today, but this was far from over. Back at the cafe, Ben was already feeling the backlash. Several regular customers had left, some casting disapproving looks his way. But Ben held firm, his face hardened with stubborn pride. He'd done what his father had always taught him: stand his ground, no matter the cost. But the cost of his actions was about to be much higher than he'd ever imagined. Would have wanted him to stand firm and do what he believed was right. But then, why did he feel this gnawing unease in the pit of his stomach? As the day wore on, word of what had happened at Ben's cafe spread through the town like wildfire. People gathered on street corners and in front yards, their voices hushed as they discussed the shocking incident. James Porter was a respected figure, a man known and admired by nearly everyone in the community. Many could hardly believe that Ben, a man who had always seemed friendly and fair, could harbor such deep-rooted prejudice. But there was one person who, when he heard the news, felt a surge of anger unlike anything he'd felt before. Miles Porter, James's son, was in his Washington, D.C. office when he received a call from a family friend back home. As he listened to the story of his father's treatment, his grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles white with barely contained rage. Miles Porter wasn't just any concerned son. He was a powerful U.S. senator, well known for his tireless work on civil rights and veterans issues. Miles had spent his career fighting to build a more just society, striving to ensure that people were treated with dignity, no matter their background. Now, his own father had been subjected to blatant discrimination. The bitter irony only fueled his determination to make things right. When the call ended, Miles leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He could use his influence and position to bring the weight of the law down on Ben Roberts. He could make an example out of him, show the world that such behavior wouldn't be tolerated. But as tempting as that was, he knew that heavy-handed tactics could deepen the divides in his father's hometown and breed even more resentment. No, this situation called for a different approach. After a moment's thought, Miles leaned forward, picked up his phone, and began making a series of calls. He had contacts he could rely on, and favors he could call in. Whatever came next, Ben Roberts had no idea what was coming. Miles was determined to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. As the sun began to set on the small southern town, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the community to its core. The prejudice of one man was about to meet the unbreakable determination of a son fighting for his father's dignity. When the dust settled, nothing would ever be the same. If you're moved by this story so far, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of justice and resilience. Redemption was in the air as the next morning dawned bright and clear, but the atmosphere in town was thick with tension. Word of James Porter's treatment at Ben's cafe had spread quickly, and people gathered in small groups, buzzing with anticipation about what might happen next. Ben Roberts arrived at his cafe early as usual, ready to start his morning routine. But as he approached, he noticed something out of the ordinary. A small crowd had gathered outside, holding signs that read "No to Prejudice" and "Respect for All." Ben's face flushed as he pushed through them, fumbling with the key to unlock the door, hands trembling with frustration. Once inside, he tried to go about his usual tasks, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Every jingle of the doorbell made him jump, half expecting to see James or maybe the police. As the morning wore on and nothing happened, Ben started to relax, thinking that perhaps things would blow over. But just as the lunch rush was starting, the bell rang again, and Ben looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway was a man he didn't recognize, yet there was something about him, His presence commanded attention. He was tall, well-dressed, and had an air of authority that immediately put Ben on edge. The man walked up to the counter, his gaze sweeping over the cafe before settling on Ben. "Are you Ben Roberts?" he asked, his tone calm but with an unmistakable edge. Ben nodded, unable to speak. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Ben. "I'm Miles Porter," he said. Ben's stomach dropped as he realized who he was facing, James's son. "I believe we need to have a conversation about what happened here yesterday." Ben felt a flicker of fear. He'd heard vague rumors that James had a son involved in politics, but he dismissed them as small-town exaggeration. Now, face-to-face with reality, he felt his defenses rise. "Look," he began, voice rough, "I don't know who you think you are, but this is my business. I have the right to serve or refuse service to anyone I choose." Miles's expression stayed neutral, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Is that so?" he replied, his voice soft but unwavering. "And on what grounds did you refuse service to my father, a decorated veteran who's been part of this community longer than you've been alive?" Ben's face turned red. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped. "Your father and people like him aren't welcome here. End of story." A stunned silence fell over the diner. The other patrons looked on, torn between horror and fascination as they watched the scene unfold. Miles stood perfectly still, his gaze never leaving Ben. When he spoke again, his voice was low, controlled, and filled with a quiet fury that made Ben instinctively step back. "Mr. Roberts," Miles said evenly, "I had hoped for a civil discussion, but it's clear that won't be possible. So let me be very clear. What you did yesterday wasn't just morally wrong. Reprehensible. It was illegal. And I intend to use every resource at my disposal to make sure you face the full consequences of your actions." For the first time, Ben's bravado faltered. He stammered, "What do you mean? You can't do anything to me. This is my business." Miles's smile was cold and resolute. "Oh, Mr. Roberts," he said quietly, "you have no idea who you're dealing with. I'm not just James Porter's son. I'm a United States Senator. And I've devoted my career to fighting exactly the kind of bigotry you displayed yesterday." The color drained from Ben's face as he absorbed the full impact of Miles's words. He'd thrown out the father of a U.S. Senator, a man who now held the power to make his life very difficult indeed. "This isn't over," Miles said, turning to leave. "You'll be hearing from me again very soon." As the door closed behind him, the cafe erupted in whispers. Ben stood frozen behind the counter, the enormity of what he'd done finally settling in. He'd thought he was defending values that his father had instilled in him, but now, faced with the grim reality of his actions, he began to question if those beliefs were worth the cost he was about to pay. But Miles Porter's visit was only the beginning. The wheels of justice were already turning, and Ben's life was about to be upended in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The town was on the brink of a reckoning, one that would force its residents to confront deeply held biases and challenge the peaceful facade they'd maintained for generations. As Miles strode down the sidewalk outside the cafe, his polished shoes clicking with purpose, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's done," he said. "He's exactly as stubborn and prejudiced as we thought. Time to move to phase 2. Inside the cafe, Ben was left reeling. He clumsily tried to pour a cup of coffee for a customer, spilling half of it in the process, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. He'd always seen himself as a good man, a cornerstone of the community. But now, for the first time, doubt began to seep in. Bookmark, go back. As the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire world was unraveling. Every time the bell above the door chimed, he flinched, half expecting federal agents or lawyers to walk in. But the reality turned out to be far more unsettling. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation he faced. It was the quiet, unrelenting judgment of his community. Regular customers who'd come to his cafe for years now avoided eye contact or stayed away altogether. Those who did come in sat in strained silence, the usual cheerful chatter replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. Ben could feel their eyes on him, could almost hear their silent condemnation. As closing time approached, Ben slumped into a booth, head in his hands. The once bustling cafe now seemed like a hollow shell, the weight of his actions and their consequences pressing down on him, as if even the walls themselves were echoing his regrets. The dinner crowd was eerily thin that night, and for the first time, Ben allowed himself to consider that he might have made a terrible mistake. Meanwhile, across town, James Porter sat quietly in his modest living room, surrounded by photos and mementos from his years of service. He picked up a framed picture of himself and his late wife, Margaret, taken on the day he'd returned from the war. They both looked so young, so hopeful for the future. "Oh, Margaret," he murmured, running a finger over her smiling face, "what would you say if you could see all this happening now?" The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke him from his thoughts. A moment later, his son Miles stepped inside. Father and son embraced, the pain of recent events unspoken but heavy between them. "How did it go?" James asked as they settled into their chairs. Miles's jaw tightened. "About as well as expected. He's not going to change his mind easily, Dad, but don't worry, we have a plan." James nodded slowly, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. I never thought it would come to this. Ben and we weren't close friends, but I thought there was a respect between us. To learn he saw me as less than human because of my skin color. It hurts, son. It hurts deep." Miles leaned forward, clasping his father's weathered hand in his own. "I know, Dad, and that's why we can't let this stand. What happened to you isn't just about you. It's about every person of color in this town, in this country, who still faces discrimination every day. We have to take a stand." James looked at his son, seeing in him that same fire for justice that had driven him in his youth. He felt a swell of pride mixed with a tinge of sadness. This wasn't the world he'd hoped to leave for Miles, but he was grateful that his son had the strength and position to fight for change. "What's the next step?" James asked, his voice stronger now. Miles's eyes glinted with determination and a hint of something else, a plan already in motion. "Well, Dad, here's where things get interesting. I did some digging. Turns out Ben's in financial trouble. The cafe isn't doing as well as he lets on, and he's been trying to sell it for years." James's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Sell the cafe? But it's been in his family for generations." "Exactly," Miles replied with a nod. "He's been reluctant to let it go, clinging to what he's always known. But after today's incident, I think he might be more willing, especially if the right offer comes along." James leaned back, his brow furrowed as he considered his son's words. "What are you planning, son?" Miles's smile was resolute, a hint of mischief lighting his eyes. "Let's just say Ben Roberts is about to get an offer he can't refuse. And when this is over, that cafe is going to stand for something very different, something better." The vision was clear in his mind. What had once been a symbol of exclusion could become a welcoming space, a place that celebrated unity and resilience. And as James listened, he felt a renewed hope, knowing his son would not only confront injustice, but turn the tables on it, creating something powerful for the future. As night fell over the small town, the seeds of change had been sown, though Ben Roberts remained unaware of just how drastically his world was about to shift. In the coming days, the very fabric of the community would be tested, forcing everyone, including Tom, to confront their biases and reevaluate what they believed. The next morning, Ben arrived at his diner earlier than usual, having slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of angry crowds and looming lawsuits. As he unlocked the front door, his gaze fell on a thick envelope that had been slipped underneath. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a formal-looking document, and as Tom read the contents, his face drained of color. It was an anonymous offer to purchase his diner, offered through a law firm he'd never heard of, at nearly twice the market value. At the bottom of the letter was a note. "This offer is time-sensitive and contingent upon your immediate departure from the premises and agreement not to open another business in this area." Ben's mind whirled. Who would make such an offer, and why now? He hated to admit it, but the diner had been struggling financially for years, and the thought of selling had crossed his mind more than once. He'd always pushed it aside, however, clinging to the legacy his father had left him. But now, facing the fallout from his confrontation with James Porter and his son, this offer seemed like an escape, a way out of the storm he'd created. Yet, something about the offer felt off. The timing was too perfect, the conditions too precise. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden agenda behind it. As he stood there, lost in thought, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see Maria, his longtime waitress, entering. She paused, her expression guarded as she took in his troubled face. "Ben, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Quickly, Tom shoved the letter into his pocket. "I'm fine," he replied gruffly, though his voice betrayed him. "Just got a lot on my mind." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with both concern and disappointment. "Ben, about yesterday, what you did to Mr. Porter, it wasn't right. People are talking. Some are saying they won't come back here." A surge of defensiveness flared up in Ben. "It's my diner. I can serve who I want," he snapped. Maria flinched at his tone, and immediately, James regretted his outburst. He ran a hand through his graying hair, feeling every year weighing down on him. "I'm sorry, Maria. I didn't mean to snap. It's just everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Maria's expression softened. "Maybe you could start by apologizing to Mr. Porter. It's not too late to make things right." Ben's jaw tightened. The thought of apologizing to James Porter went against everything his father had taught him. His father's bitter and prejudiced words echoing in his mind. But for the first time, James found himself questioning those beliefs. The day passed slowly, the diner remaining eerily empty. The usual lunch rush never came, leaving Tom with more than enough time to brood. The letter in his pocket seemed to burn against him, a constant reminder of the choice he was being forced to make. He found himself wondering if perhaps his father's legacy wasn't worth defending, if it meant pushing away the community and clinging to a prejudice he no longer wanted to carry. Across town, Miles Porter was deep in conversation with a group of local community leaders. The room was filled with both anger and determination as Miles laid out his vision. "What happened to my father isn't an isolated incident," he began, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "It's a symptom of a deeper problem in our community, but we have an opportunity to turn this into a catalyst for real change." An older woman, the head of the local NAACP chapter, leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing, Senator?" Miles smiled. "We're going to buy Ben Robbers." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Someone asked, "Why would we want to do that?" "Because," Miles explained, "we're going to transform it into something new. A place that brings people together instead of dividing them. A symbol of unity and progress, right here in the heart of our town." As he shared his vision, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Skepticism gave way to excitement as people began to see the potential impact his plan could have. What had started as a painful incident could become the seed for something meaningful. Something that would change the town for generations. Meanwhile, James Porter sat on his front porch, lost in thought. The events of the past days had stirred up memories he'd long kept buried. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back in the jungles of Vietnam, surrounded by the chaos of war. In his mind, he could see the face of Ben Robbers Sr., Ben Jr.'s father, his friend and fellow soldier. They had fought side by side, relying on each other to survive. But then came that fateful day, the day that changed everything. James remembered the new recruit, a young black soldier fresh out of basic training, terrified and overwhelmed. In a moment of panic, the young man made a fatal mistake that cost the lives of several men, including Tom Sr.'s best friend. In the wake of that loss, Ben Sr. was consumed by grief and anger. Unable to bear the pain, he'd turned it into hatred, blaming not just the young soldier, but all black men for his suffering. John had watched helplessly as his friend was consumed by that bitterness, unable to see that it was the brutality of war, not the color of anyone's skin, that was the real enemy. As James opened his eyes, he felt a deep sadness. He understood now where Tom Jr.'s prejudice had come from. It was a legacy of pain and misunderstanding, passed from father to son. But understanding didn't make it right. John knew that if there was ever going to be real change, the cycle had to be broken. Back at the diner, Ben was closing up for the night when he heard a knock at the door. He looked up to see Miles standing outside. For a moment, Ben considered pretending he hadn't seen him. But something in Miles's expression made him hesitate. With a heavy sigh, he unlocked the door. "We're closed," he said, his voice gruff. Miles nodded. "I know. I'm not here as a customer, Mr. Robbers. I'm here to talk." Tom hesitated but stepped aside, allowing Miles in. They stood in the empty diner, the weight of history and unspoken grievances hanging heavy between them. "I know about the offer you received," Miles said, cutting straight to the point. Miles' words hit hard. "The choice is yours, Mr. Robbers, to break the cycle of hatred and start anew." Ben stared back, caught off guard by the glimmer of hope rather than judgment in Miles's eyes. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart began to crumble, and for the first time, he felt the stirrings of change. As the sun rose the next morning, Ben stood outside his diner with his keys in hand. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and stepped inside, knowing it might be his last time. The familiar scent of coffee and fried food filled the air, bringing with it a flood of memories. He could almost see his father standing behind the counter, hear the laughter from simpler times, before bitterness had twisted everything. He walked to the small office in the back and sank heavily into the old chair, the offer letter in his hand. He read it one last time, then picked up the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the page. "This is Ben Robbers," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm calling about the offer to buy my diner. I accept." As he hung up, a mix of sadness and relief washed over him. The diner that had been his family's pride for generations would soon belong to someone else. But amid the sadness, there was also a glimmer of something else: hope. Hope for a fresh start, a chance to be better than he'd been. Across town, Miles Robbers' phone buzzed with a text. He read it quickly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's done," he said to his father, who sat across from him at the breakfast table. James Porter nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "And now?" he asked. Miles's smile grew. "Now, Dad, we move to phase 2. It's time to transform that diner into something that will unite this community rather than divide it." Over the next few weeks, the town became abuzz with whispers and anticipation as word spread of the transformation underway at the old diner. People watched as workers came and went, making changes to a place that had long been part of their community, curious about what it would become. Finally, the doors opened on a new establishment with a new name, a space dedicated to community and unity. The walls were lined with photographs and stories of the town's history, celebrating diversity and resilience. And in a quiet corner, a plaque honored James Porter and his friends who had served, reminding everyone that true courage came from standing together, not from division. For Ben, the journey had only just begun. But he had taken the first step, and with it, he'd set in motion a powerful wave of change. The diner had become something more than just a business. It had become a place where the town could begin to heal, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into a brighter future together. The town was buzzing with excitement and speculation as news spread quickly that Ben Robbers had sold his diner. Rumors flew about who the new owner might be. Some thought a major restaurant chain was coming, while others whispered it would reopen as a high-end coffee shop. But when the truth was finally revealed, it left everyone stunned. On a bright Saturday morning, the newly renovated diner was unveiled. A curious crowd gathered outside, eager to see the changes that had been made. Right at noon, the doors swung open, and a wave of surprised gasps rippled through the onlookers. Standing in the doorway, smiling warmly, was James Porter. "Welcome, everyone," James announced, his voice confident and welcoming. "Welcome to the veterans' table." A murmur of confusion and astonishment spread through the crowd. James Porter, the man who had been turned away from this very diner just weeks before, was now its owner. He stepped aside, inviting everyone to come inside and explore the changes for themselves. As people entered, they were greeted by a completely transformed space. The walls were decorated with photos and memorabilia from different wars, paying tribute to veterans of all races and backgrounds. The booths had been reupholstered in a deep blue, reminiscent of military uniforms. But the most striking feature was a large mural on the back wall. It depicted a diverse group of soldiers standing together in unity, their faces reflecting determination and camaraderie. At the center of the mural were two figures, a young black soldier and a young white soldier, their arms around each other's shoulders. For those familiar with the story, the resemblance to a young James Porter and Ben Robbers Sr. was unmistakable. As people absorbed the changes, James made his way to the center of the room. Friends, neighbors, he began, his voice filled with emotion. This diner has been part of our community for many years, but it has also symbolized division and prejudice. Today, we are changing that. Today, it becomes a place of unity, understanding, and healing. James explained that the Veterans Table would be more than just a restaurant. It would be a gathering place, a supportive space where veterans and people from all backgrounds could come together to share meals and stories. There would be regular events focused on fostering understanding and breaking down barriers. As he spoke, the initial shock in the crowd turned into enthusiasm. People nodded in agreement, some wiping away tears. The atmosphere shifted, filled with a sense of hope and possibility. But there was one more surprise. As James finished speaking, he gestured toward the kitchen. And now I'd like to introduce our new head chef. The kitchen doors swung open, and a hush fell over the crowd. Standing there, wearing a crisp chef's uniform, was Ben Robbers. Ben stepped forward, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched as if preparing for a harsh reception. When he finally looked up, he saw not anger or judgment, but a room full of curious faces. I know I'm probably the last person you expected to see here," Ben began, his voice unsteady, "and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness for what I did." Tom took a deep breath, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "I know now just how deeply wrong I was, but James and Miles Porter have given me a chance I don't deserve, a chance to learn, to grow, to be better than I was, and I promise I'll spend every day trying to earn the trust they've shown me." The diner was silent as Ben's words settled over the crowd. Then slowly someone began to clap. Others joined in, and soon the room filled with applause. It wasn't full forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement of Tom's commitment to change and the courage it took to own his mistakes in front of the whole community. As the applause faded, John stepped forward again. "This is what the Veterans Table is all about," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "It's about second chances, about healing old wounds, and about building a future together. And I hope each of you will be a part of that journey." With those words, James officially declared the diner open. People began to mingle, sampling the food and exploring the transformed space. There was a new energy in the air, an openness, a sense that real change was possible. Conversations sparked between people who'd rarely spoken to each other before, and a shared sense of purpose began to take root. In the kitchen, Ben worked alongside his new team, a diverse group of people he might never have considered hiring in the past. With each dish he prepared, each grateful smile he received, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, James and Miles Porter stood back, watching their vision come to life. "Do you think this will work, Dad?" Miles asked quietly. James smiled, a light of optimism in his eyes. "It's a start, son, and sometimes a good start is all you need to change the world." As the day unfolded, the Veterans Table buzzed with activity. People who had once been strangers shared tables, swapped stories, and found common ground. The walls that had divided the community for so long began to crumble, one conversation at a time. In the weeks and months that followed, the Veterans Table became more than a diner. It became a beacon of hope and transformation. Regular events encouraged open conversations about difficult topics, bridging divides that had existed for generations. Ben Robbers, true to his word, worked tirelessly to earn the community's trust. He listened, he learned, and he grew. Slowly but surely, people began to see him not as the prejudiced man he had been, but as a testament to the power of redemption. The story of the Veterans Table spread beyond the town's borders. News outlets covered the remarkable transformation of both the diner and its former owner, and a documentary filmmaker even approached James and Miles about sharing their story with a wider audience. But perhaps the most powerful moment came nearly a year after the diner's reopening, when Ben's father, Ben Robbers Sr., came to visit. Wheelchair-bound and frail, the elder Robbers was a shadow of the strong, bitter man he had once been. As Ben wheeled him into the diner, the elderly man's eyes scanned the walls covered in photos and stories of veterans from all backgrounds. It was a silent acknowledgement of a world that had changed, one he had never thought possible. The journey had come full circle, as father and son faced the new legacy that had risen from the ashes of the past. The veterans' table, once a place of exclusion, was now a symbol of healing, transformation, and the belief that even the most divided communities could find unity and hope. Ben Roberts' eyes widened in disbelief as he took in the mural, the diverse crowd filling the diner, and his son working contentedly alongside people he would once have scorned. For the first time in decades, tears welled up in his eyes. He reached out, grasping James's hand. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "All these years, I was so wrong." That day, surrounded by the warmth and unity at the veterans' table, old wounds began to heal. Ben Roberts shared stories from his time in the war, but now without bitterness. He spoke of the fear, the chaos, and the shared humanity of soldiers on all sides. His voice carried a new perspective, one that moved everyone who listened. As the sun set over the town, the air felt lighter, as though the pain of the past was finally lifting. Standing outside the diner, James looked up at the sign that now read, "The Veterans Table." He thought about the long journey they had all endured to get to this moment, the pain, the struggles, and the many moments of Ben Roberts' doubt. Yet all of it had led here, to a place of healing and transformation. Inside, he could see Tom Sr. surrounded by veterans from all backgrounds, sharing stories and nodding in understanding as they listened. A community united. John felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Miles standing beside him. "You did it, Dad," Miles said softly. "You changed everything." James shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "No, son, we did it. Together, all of us." As they stood there watching the scene inside, neither could have imagined the ripple effect their actions would soon have beyond their small town. The story of the veterans' table was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning a new chapter. The very next morning, as James was getting ready to open the diner, he received a surprising call. A producer from a national news network wanted to do a feature on the veterans' table and the transformation it had sparked in the community. At first, John hesitated. He hadn't done any of this for attention or praise. But as he thought about it, he realized that sharing their story might inspire others to take similar steps in their own towns. With that in mind, he agreed to the interview. When the news crew arrived, the whole town buzzed with excitement. People gathered outside the diner, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cameras or maybe even be interviewed. Inside, John sat at one of the booths, the mural of diverse soldiers serving as a powerful backdrop. As the interview began, he spoke openly about the incident that had started it all, the pain of facing such open prejudice, and the decision to respond with love and understanding instead of anger. "It would have been easy to respond to hatred with more hatred," James said, his voice steady. "But that would only continue the cycle. Instead, we chose to make this an opportunity for growth and healing." The reporter then turned to Ben Roberts, who had joined them at the booth. Ben's hands trembled slightly, but his voice grew stronger as he shared his story of change. "I was raised with certain beliefs," Ben began, nodding as he spoke, "beliefs that I now realize were wrong. I never thought I could change, but James and Miles, they showed me that there was a different way, a better way. This place, it's taught me that healing is possible, even for someone like me." As the interview wrapped up, it became clear that the veterans' table had become more than a diner. It had become a beacon of hope and transformation, a testament to the power of redemption. And as word of the veterans' table spread, it inspired people in other communities to confront their own divisions, proving that one small diner could indeed change the world. "Beliefs," Ben said, his voice catching as tears glistened in his eyes. "Beliefs that I now realize were wrong." It took this experience and the incredible grace shown by James and Miles Porter to finally open my eyes. I'm not proud of the person I used to be, but now, every day, I'm working to become someone I can respect. As the interview continued, other community members stepped forward, sharing their own stories of transformation and connection. They spoke about how the veterans' table had changed their perspectives and brought together people who might never have crossed paths otherwise. The atmosphere in the diner had evolved into one of warmth and understanding, with old barriers breaking down and new bonds forming. The reporter, visibly moved by the stories, turned to James with one final question. "What do you hope people take away from your story?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "I hope people understand that change is always possible, even in the face of deeply rooted prejudices. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But with patience, empathy, and a willingness to see the humanity in everyone, we can build a better, more united world." As the news crew packed up, a sense of excitement hung in the air. Everyone knew that once their story aired, things would never be the same. And they were right. The feature story aired on a Sunday evening during prime time, captivating millions across the country with the tale of a small southern town's journey from division to unity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media lit up with support, and calls poured into the network. Overnight, the Veterans Table became a national topic of discussion. In the days that followed, the diner saw a steady stream of visitors from all over the country. People traveled hours, even days, to experience the atmosphere of acceptance and healing for themselves. But it wasn't just tourists who were drawn to the diner. Community leaders from across the nation reached out, eager to learn how they could create similar spaces of unity and growth in their own towns. James and Miles found themselves fielding calls and emails from people seeking advice on bridging divides and promoting healing within their own communities. The story's impact went further than they could have dreamed. A group of filmmakers approached James, Miles, and Ben about creating a documentary, not just on the Veterans Table, but on the larger themes of prejudice, forgiveness, and community healing. As filming began, the three men revisited the moments that had brought them here. Reliving some of those difficult memories stirred up old emotions, but it also reminded them of how far they'd come and deepened their commitment to their cause. For months, the documentary crew captured the day-to-day life of the diner, the community events hosted there, and the ongoing journeys of healing and growth. They interviewed townspeople, veterans who had found solace and camaraderie at the Veterans Table, and even some of those who had initially been skeptical of the changes. One of the most powerful moments of the documentary came when Ben Roberts, voice full of raw emotion, shared his journey from a place of anger to one of understanding. The camera captured the genuine connections formed around the tables of the diner, moments of laughter, tears, and friendship that reflected a community transformed. The documentary would go on to inspire countless others, proving that even the most divided communities could find unity and hope with patience, empathy, and a commitment to change. During an interview for the documentary, Ben Roberts Sr., despite his declining health, spoke with a deep honesty about the roots of his prejudice and the profound impact that love and forgiveness had had on him. "I carried this anger for so many years," he admitted, his voice frail but his eyes steady. "I let one tragic moment in the war shape how I viewed an entire group of people. But being here now, seeing what my son and John have created together, it's changed me. I only wish I had learned this lesson sooner." As the documentary neared completion, word spread about its production, sparking growing anticipation. Major film festivals expressed interest in premiering it, with some even speculating about Oscar potential. Yet for James, Miles, and Ben, true success wasn't about awards or recognition. It was about the small, everyday changes they witnessed in their community and the stories they heard from people who had found inspiration through their journey. One evening, after a long day of filming, James sat at the counter of the Veterans Table, nursing a cup of coffee. The diner was quiet, the last customers having already left. Tom was cleaning up in the kitchen while Miles sat nearby, focused on paperwork. Breaking the comfortable silence, James remarked, "You know, when all of this began, I never could have imagined where it would lead." Miles looked up, a smile crossing his face. "So you didn't see yourself becoming a national symbol for community healing and racial reconciliation?" James chuckled, shaking his head. "Not at all. I just wanted to stand up for what was right, to show that love could overcome hate." Ben stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. "And look at all that Stand has created," he said, gesturing around the diner. "You've changed so many lives, James, mine most of all." James reached over, resting a hand on Ben's shoulder. "We've all changed, Ben. That's the beauty of it. We're all on this journey together." Sitting there, the three men who had once been divided felt a deep gratitude for the path that had brought them to this moment. Little did they know that their journey was far from over. With the documentary's release, their story would soon reach a global audience, inspiring movements for change and reconciliation in ways they could never have imagined. The premiere of Table of Brotherhood, the Veterans' Table story, took place in a packed theater in New York City. James, Miles, and Ben found themselves walking the red carpet, an experience they had never dreamed of. As they took their seats in the darkened theater, surrounded by film industry elites, civil rights leaders, and media figures, they felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. How would their story be received by this diverse, worldly audience? The film opened with the original incident at the diner, unapologetically portraying the raw reality of racism. Many in the audience gasped at Ben's initial treatment of James, but as the story unfolded, showing the transformation of individuals and of the entire community, the atmosphere in the theater shifted. By the time the credits rolled, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Thunderous applause broke out, and as James, Miles, and Ben made their way to the stage for a Q&A, they were greeted with a standing ovation. The questions from the audience were thoughtful and insightful. One viewer asked James how he had found the strength to forgive Ben. James paused for a moment before answering. James began his response, his voice thick with emotion. "Forgiveness isn't about dismissing what happened," he said. "It's about choosing not to let hatred control you. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, even those who have caused you pain. It's not an easy choice, but it's a necessary one if we want to move forward as a society." Another audience member turned to Ben and asked what he would say to others who held the same prejudices he once did. Ben took a deep breath, gripping the podium tightly. "I'd tell them that holding on to hate only harms you in the end. It blinds you to the beauty of human diversity and to the experiences you could share when you open your heart to others. I wasted so many years trapped in anger and fear. Don't make the same mistake I did." The documentary's impact was immediate and far-reaching. A major streaming platform picked it up for worldwide distribution, sparking conversations about race, reconciliation, and community healing in living rooms, classrooms, and boardrooms around the world. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt back home. In the months following the release, the Veterans' Table became a kind of pilgrimage site. People from across the country and even abroad visited to experience firsthand the spirit of acceptance and healing fostered there. James, Miles, and Ben found themselves in demand as speakers at conferences and events focused on community building and racial reconciliation. They shared their journey, always emphasizing that the change they achieved was possible anywhere, with commitment and compassion. The diner itself continued to grow. With the influx of visitors, they expanded operations, always keeping their mission of veteran support and community healing at the center. They launched a mentorship program, pairing veterans with at-risk youth in the community. The program was a resounding success, offering young people guidance while providing veterans with a renewed sense of purpose. Over the months, the ripple effect of the Veterans' Table spread in unexpected ways. Inspired by their story, other communities began creating their own versions of the diner. From small towns in the Midwest to large coastal cities, people came together to address long-standing divides and work toward healing. One day, about a year after the documentary's release, John received a call that left him speechless. A prominent national civil rights organization, moved by their story, wanted to invite James, Miles, and Ben to their annual conference to speak about their experiences and share insights on community healing and racial reconciliation. The day of the conference felt surreal. Walking through halls filled with civil rights leaders and activists, John couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come, from a small-town diner to a national stage. Their journey had been extraordinary. Their presentation at the conference was both humbling and inspiring. The audience listened intently as they shared their story, asking thoughtful questions and expressing admiration for what they had achieved. Afterward, the organization's president addressed them, saying, "What you've done is provide a roadmap for healing in communities across our nation. You've shown that change is possible, even in the face of deep-seated prejudice and historical divisions." As they left the conference, James, Miles, and Ben felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Their journey from that small diner had touched countless lives, and they knew that the work they had begun was only just beginning. The organization announced it would be launching a national initiative inspired by the Veterans Table, dedicated to fostering community healing and racial reconciliation across the country. James, Miles, and Ben were invited to serve as advisors to the program. News of the conference and this new initiative brought a fresh wave of attention to the Veterans Table, with news crews flooding the small town to capture the community's reaction. Amidst the excitement and media coverage, however, James, Miles, and Ben stayed grounded, focused on the daily work they knew made a lasting difference. They understood that true change wasn't built on grand gestures or recognition, but through the steady, everyday efforts of people committed to bridging divides. Back at the diner, life carried on. Veterans continued to find comfort and support within its walls, and community members from all backgrounds came together over meals, sharing their stories and gradually dismantling old prejudices. Tom, who had once symbolized division in the town, kept moving forward on his journey of growth and redemption. One evening, as the sun set and the last customers were leaving, John found Tom standing in front of the mural, lost in thought. "A penny for your thoughts?" John asked, coming to stand beside him. Ben stayed silent for a moment before replying quietly, "I was just thinking about my father. I think he would have been proud of what we've done here, but also sad about all the years he wasted, filled with anger and bitterness." James nodded, sensing the weight of Ben's reflections. "Your father's story, like yours, shows that it's never too late to change. His journey, along with yours, is part of what makes this place so meaningful." As they stood together, gazing at the mural of soldiers of all races united in camaraderie, they heard the diner door open behind them. Turning, they saw Miles walking in, an unmistakable look of excitement on his face. "You're not going to believe this," Miles said, waving a letter. "We've been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize." James and Tom exchanged astonished glances. The Nobel Peace Prize? It seemed almost impossible to think their small-town diner could be up for such a monumental honor. "The nomination cites our work in community healing and racial reconciliation," Miles continued, reading from the letter. "They say we've provided a model for addressing deep-rooted societal divides in a peaceful and transformative way." As the news settled in, James felt a swell of mixed emotions: pride in what they had achieved, humility at being recognized in such a way, and a renewed sense of commitment to the mission that had begun in their little town. Together, they had created something that would resonate far beyond the walls of the diner. With a renewed sense of determination, James smiled and said, "Well, I guess we'd better get back to work. There's still a lot of healing to do." Ben nodded, and Miles chuckled at his father's understated reaction to the incredible news. As they locked up the diner that night, the three men couldn't help but reflect on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. What began as a single act of prejudice had transformed into a movement changing lives across the nation. The Veterans Table had grown far beyond a simple diner. It had become a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of forgiveness, and a living example of what could happen when people chose to heal old wounds and build a brighter future together. Stepping out into the quiet night, they glanced back at the warm glow of the Veterans Table's neon sign, a symbol of the light they'd brought into a world often shadowed by division and hatred. The story of James Porter, Miles Porter, and Ben Robbers was far from over. In many ways, it felt like their journey was just beginning. With every life they touched, every community they inspired, and every barrier they helped break down, they were writing a new chapter in America's pursuit of equality and understanding. And to think, it had all started with a simple act of forgiveness in a small-town diner. What would you have done if you were in James Porter's position? Could you have found the strength to forgive and create something meaningful out of a painful experience? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story as much as we did, be sure to check out this next one. It's sure to warm your heart. Just click here to watch.